Thank you for watching this video from the Center for European Studies at Carleton University. This event was organized by the Center for European Studies and Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, and supported by Carleton University and by grants from the European Union and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the European Union, Center for European Studies, and Carleton University.
Welcome, everyone. As we heard yesterday, we have had more than 2 decades of international negotiations that have failed to produce binding commitments and robust responses by national governments. And this failure, as we also heard yesterday, strikes particularly hard and close here in Canada. And we began to discuss yesterday that there has been an increasing emphasis by both academics and practitioners on the role of cities and other subnational governments in their potential to take action that might substitute for this national and international response. And this appears to be an attractive solution. More than half of the global population currently lives in cities. That includes over 80% of Canadians. And cities produce a disproportionate share of global greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis. And there also seems to be evidence that local governments are up to the challenge. They, like their counterparts around the world, Canadian cities are creating climate change action plans. They're joining global initiatives and intergovernmental networks like the C40 Cities Initiative and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Partners for Climate Protection. But these are only the first steps. And certainly some Canadian cities have made strides towards creating climate change policy that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and that may support and encourage action in other jurisdictions. But there is significant variation among cities in terms of the climate policies and the number of climate policies that they have adopted and the likelihood that those climate change policies are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so my broader research agenda and the research agenda of many of us here in the room is to explain this variation. What makes some cities leaders in climate change, in urban sustainability? Why do some local governments enact more climate change policies than others? And we will hear more about this from the other speakers. But today I want to talk about something more basic and take a step back and think about what do we actually mean when we say that cities are enacting climate policy, when we say that cities are taking action on climate change. And so in this presentation, I want to argue that to move beyond the symbolic rhetoric of emissions, reductions targets, and climate change strategies, we have to be more rigorous in the measurement of municipal climate change policy. And this is not seemingly revolutionary. We do this at other levels of government. And I think that we need to begin to consider municipal climate change policy through the lens of the impact that it's likely to have on greenhouse gas emissions. And so incorporating the likely impact of climate policies into our measures of cities' achievements should provide a more detailed picture of the policies adopted by cities and will facilitate future research to explore why we have this variation. So what counts as climate policy? Does setting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets count? What about participating in networks? Building a plan, buying hybrid vehicles for the city fleet, asking people to turn out their lights for Earth Hour, requiring new condo towers to be built to LEED standards. And so I argue that we should define local climate change policy as an activity, practice, or bylaw that is undertaken or adopted by cities that leads to the reduction or prevention of greenhouse gas emissions. And it doesn't have to be explicitly designated as such, but it has to be a concrete action. So climate change plans are useful and necessary, but they don't count as climate change action. And I think this is something, and I'm looking here at Canadian cities, that I think we're going to see a difference between Canadian cities and European cities, or I hope that we will see such a difference. So to focus on the likely impact, I think is more interesting than their simple existence. And I'm going to argue that we should think about it in this way, because if we think about if we're thinking about climate change as a real global problem, which I hope we all are, we should be interested in the effect that these climate policies are having, and the usefulness of government efforts. So I suggest that there are 3 dimensions of the likely impact. One is the ambition, the other is the scope, and although it's a scary word, I want to argue that the coerciveness also matters. And so the ambition of the policy refers to what the targets of the policy are expected to do. And the more ambitious the policy, the greater the emissions reductions should be, all else equal. So for example, an energy efficiency policy that promoted or required a 20% reduction in energy use should be more effective and have a greater impact than one that has only 10%. Likewise, the scope of a policy refers to how many of the emissions of a municipality that it covers, what proportion, but practitioners often refer to this and know a lot about this, that you can often refer to it as corporate emissions, where corporate means the city's own emissions, the city's activities, and community is everybody else's emissions. And obviously, if you're only adopting climate policy that applies to the corporate emissions, to the city's activities' own emissions, that's a much smaller proportion of all the emissions that a city is producing. And I guess when I started studying this, I thought, well, obviously, right? That makes a lot of sense. But then when I was looking at it, it becomes clear that this is a lot of what cities are doing, is just for their own emissions. And then coerciveness is, as you can see on the PowerPoint, is the policy instrument that is selected. And I'm arguing that there's a different effectiveness depending on how coercive the policy instrument is, where information is less coercive than subsidies, which is less coercive than taxes or regulation. And this is because, again, all else equal, they are more likely to change the behavior of individuals and firms in the city as they become more coercive. And we've seen a lot of that when James was talking about Canadian policy yesterday, about how there's a difference between asking people to participate in a voluntary challenge like the 1-ton challenge or Earth Hour and requiring that they build buildings in a different way. So for the remainder of this presentation, I want to propose and demonstrate a new way of measuring Canadian municipal climate change policy. And at first cut, at measuring this policy, we could just count all the policies. And this is, there's 2 different ways that we could do this. We could use a deductive inventory or an inductive inventory. In the deductive inventory, we would just make a list in advance, look at what cities are doing, count them all up. This has the advantage of being pretty simple. It's pretty reliable. You can collect the data relatively easily. But the disadvantage is that all policies are considered to be equal. If you ask people to participate in Earth Hour, it's the same as requiring them to build buildings to LEED standards. And it may overlook policies that we don't anticipate in advance. The inductive strategy, we would actually look at every city's strategy and make our own list based on what those cities do, and this is more sensitive to context. It allows us to think about things that we might not have thought about in advance, but it might lead us to overlook things that aren't explicitly labeled as relating to climate change, which at the city level can be quite substantial. And so I want to suggest a particular way of doing this, or one way that we could do this. And so I've started by combining these 2 approaches, the deductive approach. Here are some areas that cities use climate change in. We have transportation, procurement, buildings and planning, waste management, energy, and then I have this residual category of other. And then I've listed some specific topics that fit within those categories. So if we then go into more detail, I've then identified a lot of different policies that have been adopted inductively, that I've done this inductively, adopted the policies in each of the 11 Canadian cities with populations of over 500,000 residents. And this is done using the city's official websites. And each category can include multiple specific actions, and in order to weight the actions, in other words, to give more credit for those policies that are likely to result in greater reductions, I have designated whether the policies are designed to address corporate or community emissions, and whether they are what the policy instrument that's involved. And so you can see again the three categories of coerciveness that I've noted. And as expected, as we've seen, that there is a lot of variation, or a fair amount of variation between the Canadian cities. And they do vary in terms of both their scope and their coerciveness. And if we just look at the number, right, we encounter some of the same problems that I was describing earlier. They're unweighted, you don't know whether, what exactly they are. And what they're accomplishing. But by incorporating some of the information about what kinds of policies they are, it makes it easier to see. So what we see here is that most large cities in Canada adopt more policy aimed at community emissions than at those resulting from their own emissions, which at first glance, when I was thinking about it, seems somewhat controversial, or controversial is the wrong word, surprising, because it should be more expensive, we would think, to adopt policy that applies to the community rather than to their own emissions. And so the ratio is about 2 to 1. But if we exclude voluntary and information provision, which make up an average of 38% of the city's policies aimed at community emissions, this makes the ratio a lot smaller. And a lot of these voluntary programs are things like, if you would like to exchange your lawnmower, we will give you a rebate for your gas-powered lawnmower, or that would be a subsidy, but that kind of thing. We will take in your old gas-powered lawnmower, or we will have a big campaign that everybody should turn out their lights for Earth Hour, and guess what? We'll do it too. So that counts as 2 policies in this scheme. We're going to turn out our own lights for Earth Hour. That's a corporate policy, and we're going to ask you to do it too. So what I want to be emphasizing here is that despite the sort of large numbers, these aren't huge amounts of emissions that are expected to be reduced. So I want to conclude by saying that what we measure really matters. And this, again, I hope is not revolutionary to anybody. That this is something that we really need to be thinking about the achievements of cities and the achievements of all levels of cities as we look at the achievements of all levels of government. That targets and actions are not equivalent, that all actions are not equal. And while effective climate policy is predicated on knowledge about current emissions and well-considered plans, emissions inventories, and those climate action plans are not in themselves climate policy. And when we examine and compare the climate change actions of municipalities, we should be considering not only their existence, but also the level of greenhouse gas emissions that they are likely to reduce. And I hope this will lead to a more realistic evaluation of the potential for cities, both in Canada and elsewhere, to contribute to global greenhouse gas reductions. And so by looking at Canadian cities, I find that while cities have adopted a reasonable number of policies altogether, and many of these apply to the general public and to the private sector, many of them are also based on information provision and exhortations for voluntary action. And moreover, very few of them involve taxes or regulation. Sorry, I just want to go back here for a moment. In the taxes and regulations column, the ones that go all the way down, those are anti-idling regulations for cars. So that when you're stopped in a parking lot, you shouldn't be idling your car. So these are not, for the most part, very broad regulations that are leading to huge amounts of greenhouse gas reductions. And so my findings, I hope, also suggest that there is potential for a more nuanced comparison of cities' climate change actions that will improve our ability to understand and promote climate change mitigation at the local level. And so hopefully, even though I'm very pessimistic, I want to say that I don't think that this means that there is no potential for cities. It means that we have to look deeper and work harder, especially in Canada, to get cities to be on board with the global climate change agenda.